Hello and welcome to Trinity's online service. I hope you're having a wonderful Memorial Day weekend. If you're staying at home or if you're out adventuring, I hope that you're just enjoying the beginning of summer. It's going to be hot and really rainy lately. I prefer it a little cooler, but I know a lot of you love the sun and the heat and going outside. And if you have a pool, I'm super jealous. Either way, I hope you're really excited for summertime to start and to just start relaxing a little bit, maybe, hopefully. I am so glad that you are here with us this morning. Please fill out a Connect card for me. Let us know that you're here. Go to trinitybible.link/connect. Fill that out. Let us know who you are, how we can be praying for you, or if there's any other way that we can be connecting with you. We also send out weekly emails that have all of the upcoming events for women's ministry, men's ministry, kids, the whole church. If you're not getting those emails, fill out that Connect card and we will get you on the mailing list. We don't spam you. We don't sell your information. It's really concise, awesome email that has all the information you can need. So let us know if you're not on that list and we will add you. I hope that you enjoy this morning with the worship with Charlie and then a awesome sermon from Pastor Brad. I will see you at the end. Bye.
Welcome to our online service. I'm so glad that you're able to find a moment in your week, whether it be on Sunday or some other day, and tune in so that we can come together and worship our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. Let us go ahead wherever we are, wherever you find yourself, whether it be alone or with others. Let us stand together. Let us raise our voices and worship God by singing The Way. Through every battle, through every heartbreak, through every circumstance, I believe that you are my fortress. Yes, you are my portion. You are my hiding place. I believe you are the way, the truth, the life.
making all things new. Your blood speaks a better word. Yes, it does. Your blood, measure of my worth. Your blood, more than I deserve. Your blood speaks a better word. Speaks a better word. It's seen out with light. It's shining down the lights. It echoes through the night. The precious blood of Christ speaks a better word. Speaks a better word. Your blood, robe of righteousness. Your blood, hope in my defense. Your blood, never covers me, never covers me. It's seen out with light. It's shining down the lights. It echoes through the night. The precious blood of Christ speaks a better word. Speaks a better word. It's calling out my name. It's breaking every chain. It's making all things right. The precious blood of Christ speaks a better word. Speaks a better word. It speaks a better word. It's rewriting my history. It covers me with destiny. It's making all things right. The precious blood of Christ. It's rewriting my history. It covers me with destiny. It's making all things right. The precious blood of Christ. It's rewriting my history. It covers me with destiny. It's making all things right. The precious blood of Christ. It's rewriting my history. Oh yes, oh, it covers
Hey everyone, great to be with you today. Thanks for joining us on this holiday weekend. Looking forward to this weekend kicking off the summer. I love the summer, and I've been looking forward to it, and so now it's official. And I'm thankful for the time that we can be together. That during your holiday weekend, you've set time aside to maintain your spiritual fervor by joining us and engaging with God and with His Word. So great to have you with us and looking forward to sharing with you today. I want to start with a thought that's going to sound crazy. It sounds crazy to the ears of the 21st century Christian. And that is this: when Jesus was doing ministry, He did not get excited at big crowds of people. Now that sounds crazy to us because to us, big crowds are what equals success, But Jesus' goal was not to create crowds with His ministry. He actually tried to suppress the crowds. There are times that Jesus actually introduced some controversial teachings for the very purpose of driving disinterested people away. So He wasn't interested in crowds because His goal was not to create a movement. Jesus' vision was not to create a movement. Jesus' vision was to create wholehearted followers, disciples. Jesus didn't want to be famous. Jesus didn't want to be famous. He wanted to be followed. And there's a big difference. Jesus didn't want crowds. He wanted disciples. He didn't want to just be known and liked and admired. He didn't come to be known and liked and admired. He came to set an example to be followed, a way of living, and to create that way in relationship with God. And that took some management on His part. My son asked me today as he was reading his Bible, he said, why did Jesus tell people not to tell anybody who He was? And I was able to share with him this very thought that Jesus basically experienced what celebrities today experience, that they have fans who project expectations on them. Fans project expectations on whoever they follow, and they are only fans and admirers as long as the one that they follow fulfills their expectations. When they don't fulfill their expectations anymore, that's it. But there's a difference between a fan and a follower. Fans project expectations on those they follow, but true disciples align themselves with the one they follow, and they let that person create the expectations. And Jesus experienced this dynamic in His ministry, that He had people who projected expectations on Him. You can see crowds in different instances in the Gospels force or try to force their expectations on Jesus. Some crowds, they wanted food, they wanted healing, they wanted their physical needs met, and they clamored for that. And when that happened, they were there. And when that didn't happen, they disappeared. Other crowds, they wanted revolution. They wanted to make Jesus the king. They wanted Him to free them from Roman oppression. When they thought that was going to happen, they were all on board. But when they sensed it maybe wouldn't happen, they were out of there. Jesus had people who projected their religious preferences onto Him. And as long as they could see that He might fulfill those preferences, they were following it. But once it was gone, they were out of there. And it's amazing today how those categories are still duplicated in people and their expectations of Jesus. Some people, they project their expectations of physical comfort and ease on Jesus. And they'll follow Jesus as long as it provides for their physical comforts. Others, they project political power in what it means to follow Jesus. And they expect Jesus and their following of Jesus to give them power and influence. Other people, they project their religious preferences onto Jesus. That is not why Jesus came. And that is not what Jesus offers. And if you really want to follow Jesus, you have to distinguish between your expectations and His. That's what distinguishes fans from followers. Fans project their expectations on Jesus. Followers align themselves with Jesus' expectations for them. That's what we're going to see in today's passage. It's found at the end of Matthew chapter 16. So Matthew chapter 16, and we're going to focus towards the second half of this chapter, but we really do need some context. So the context of Matthew 16 in this study. So we're studying what it means to follow Jesus. We're watching Matthew paint this portrait of a disciple. And today we're beginning to see that a disciple not only has relationship with Jesus, but being a disciple of Jesus also means imitation. And we see that in this passage we're going to look at. But the context of the passage, Matthew 16 is one of the high points. It's one of the mountain peaks of the Gospel of Matthew, especially because in verse 16, so Matthew 16:16, we see Peter's declaration, his ultimate clarity on Jesus as the Son of God and the Messiah. You remember Jesus says, "Who do people say I am?" And Peter raises his hand. He says, "Pick me. You are the Christ," verse 16 says, "the Messiah, the Son of the living God." And this declaration by Peter is a high point in the disciples' development because they're getting clarity on who Jesus is. They're developing a very clear picture that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God. He is both Lord and Christ. And this is a high point in their development. But along with this increasing clarity, there are some expectations that are coming along with this. And the question is going to be, do their expectations of what it means that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, are those expectations the same as Jesus' expectations of what that means? So here they are, ironically, at their greatest point of clarity, and they are 100% right. Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God. And they are exactly right about that. They have clarity they've never had before. But because of that clarity, or part of that clarity, leads them to develop some expectations. And Jesus' expectations and their expectations begin to diverge at this very point. It's ironic that at their greatest point of clarity, the expectations begin to diverge. And we're going to see that here. So we've already read Peter make this great declaration. You are the Messiah, the Christ, the Son of the living God, in verse 16. Now let's begin reading in our passage. So after Peter makes this declaration, verse 20, then Jesus ordered his disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah. Peter makes this declaration, and the next thing Jesus says, don't tell anybody what you just told me. And verse 21, from that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and on the third day raised to life. Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Never, Lord, this shall never happen to you. And Jesus turned and said to Peter, get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns. And then Jesus said to his disciples, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will find it. What good will it be for someone to gain the whole world yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? For the Son of Man is going to come in his Father's glory with his angels, and then he will reward each person according to what they have done. Truly I tell you, some who are standing here will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. So, we see this passage. We see Jesus make a prediction. It's one of the first times that he begins to really explain to the disciples what's going to happen next. And Peter responds with his super strong feelings. Now, we got to put all this together. This event where Peter says, no, this is never going to happen to you. This event falls right on the heels of Peter's declaration that you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And that level of clarity just a few verses earlier, this high point in Jesus' ministry so far. And the disciples are beginning to get clarity on who Jesus is. And they are following the long-promised Messiah. And they are his disciples. But now in the midst of that clarity, Jesus reveals his true purpose in coming. His true purpose, he must go to Jerusalem, suffer many things at the hands of the elders, chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and he must be killed, and on the third day raised to life. And look how Peter responds. He takes him aside. Verses Peter took Jesus aside. Can you imagine? He takes Jesus by the arm and says, "Hey, I need a word," right? And he takes him aside and began to rebuke him. Can you imagine the disciple rebuking the master? That's what happens here. And Peter says, "Never, Lord, this shall never happen to you." Now, why does Peter respond so strongly? Well, it's because Peter loves Jesus, and he doesn't want anything to happen to Jesus. Okay, I'll buy that, but I think there's more. Why else does Peter respond this strongly? I think it's easy to read into this passage. I think it's all about Peter's love for Jesus. But we know enough about Peter to know Peter doesn't just love Jesus. Peter loves Peter as well. He loves Jesus, but he loves Peter. And Peter has hitched his wagon to Jesus. And if things go south for Jesus, they're going to go south for Peter too. And that is so undesirable to Peter that out of his love for Jesus and his love for himself, it is so undesirable to Peter that this would happen that he tries to impose his expectations onto Jesus and suggests that Jesus bypass the whole idea of dying in Jerusalem. Just forget about that. And Peter proposes something that would derail Jesus' very purpose in coming, to die and be raised back to life. And Jesus' response is appropriate. I mean, he rebukes Peter right back. And then he says, get behind me, Satan. Eugene Peterson translates it, paraphrases it. Satan, get lost. That's what he says. And then Jesus goes on to say, after he says, you get behind me, Satan, you get lost, he says to his disciples, verse 24, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny himself. He not only rebukes Peter for denying that Jesus should go and die and be raised to life, but he says, not only is this my trajectory, this is going to be your trajectory too, if you choose to follow me. Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. This is Jesus' most emphasized saying in the Gospels. He's already said it once in the Gospel of Matthew, back in chapter 10. But here he ties it to his own death. He ties it to his own death, which he'd just been predicting. And Jesus is saying, listen, just like my life mission revolves around dying, around carrying a cross and dying, your life mission is going to revolve around carrying a cross and dying. If anyone would come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. So Jesus here is doing some clarifying. He's clarifying some expectations here for what it means to follow him. And he's clarifying that following him does not mean admiring him like the crowds. It doesn't mean showing up when he has food, when he has something for you. Free lunch of bread and fish. It doesn't mean having him fit your religious preference profile perfectly. It means doing what Jesus was going to do. That's what it means to follow him. Deny your own ambitions and take up a cross and imitate him, because that's what he was going to do. And Jesus says this frequently. It's recorded throughout the Gospels, this very same teaching, that you must deny yourself and take up your cross and follow me. So what does this mean? What does it mean to deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow Jesus? Well, I think it really is about two things. It's about our posture and it's about our priority. Taking up your cross is in part about the disciples' posture. Jesus, again, remember, he's clarifying expectations. And he says, listen, follow me. You're going to need to adopt a certain kind of posture. We talked a lot about this idea in our series called Gospel Posture from the book of Philippians. And everything I say, you could go to Philippians chapter 2 and you could read that passage in Philippians 2 and you could see everything we're going to talk about. And Jesus uses this word picture of a cross. You must take up your cross. Now, the word picture of a cross, the word picture that would bring up in the disciples' mind is a lot different than what the word cross brings up in our minds today. Because the disciples, when they heard the word cross, they thought of it entirely differently. It was to them exclusively an instrument of cruelty, of shame, humiliation, and death. It was a tool of execution. And not just in execution, but what one scholar calls the most cruel form of execution then in use. I mean, it was an awful term. Now, we hear these words with 2,000 years between us and the use of crucifixion. And with 2,000 years of revering the cross and turning it into from an instrument of death into a symbol of love. But it was not a symbol of love in any way when the disciples heard Jesus say, take up your cross. I mean, that must have sent shudders down their spine because this was an instrument of cruelty and shame and humiliation and torture. And that was part of Jesus' point. He says, follow me means taking up this cross, which is to take on a posture of suffering and humility. That's what it means to take up your cross. It's a posture of suffering and humility. It is a constant downward call. And if following Jesus means a constant downward call, then he needs to clarify that at some point. And that's what he does here. He's clarifying, and he does throughout his ministry, clarifies that following him means taking on a posture of suffering and humility. That's part of what's involved in taking up your cross. But there's another angle to it as well. Taking up your cross is not just about the disciples' posture, it's also about the disciples' priorities. And that's a big part of what Jesus says. That the cross is all about agendas and whose agenda we're going to carry forward, whose agenda we're going to pursue. When we take up our cross, we are also taking up God's purposes for us. See, the Father has an agenda for the Son. God's agenda for Jesus isn't just about suffering and humility. It's the suffering and humiliation that he's going to experience as he pursues God's redemptive purposes in the world through him. And that was Jesus' mission, to be killed and on the third day raised to life. And that's why he was so appalled by Peter's suggestion that Jesus' death wasn't necessary, that he find some kind of workaround for this. Jesus was appalled by that because he knew that this was the Father's purpose for him, even though it involved suffering and humiliation. That this is why he came. To not carry this cross was to not carry out God's purposes for him. And to Jesus, that was an appalling thought from the pit of hell. And that's why he says, get behind me. You get lost, Satan. Because Jesus knew that his cross was carrying out God's purposes for him, even though it included suffering and humiliation. And it's the same for his followers. It's the same for us today. To shy away from God's purposes for us, even though those purposes may take us through suffering and humiliation and self-denial, to shy away from that is to miss out on who we are. It's to miss the whole point of who we follow. It's to miss the whole purpose we were created for. And we need to say, Satan, get lost. Because following Jesus means denying ourselves, our priorities, our agendas, taking up our cross, a posture of suffering and humiliation, and following Jesus, who did exactly the same thing. Now, at first, when you hear this, it sounds like losing, right? Take up your cross, deny yourself. I mean, that sounds like losing. Not being able to pursue our agenda, not being able to fulfill our life's expectations, the vision of the good life that our society tells us we should be running after. That seems like losing. I don't want to lose. And Jesus knows that that sounds like losing, and that's why he introduces this truth in verse 25. For whoever wants to save their life needs to lose it. And whoever loses their life, whoever does this thing that sounds like losing, for me, they'll find it. Jesus is the perfect example of this. The night that Jesus was crucified, he prayed, and he prayed, not my will, but yours be done. Jesus wanted God's agenda, not his. That required him taking up a literal cross, embracing suffering and humiliation. And Jesus said, you know what? I'd rather have your will than my will. I'd rather have your agenda over what I'm feeling right now. And I know that in that, there's going to be life. That looks like losing, but I know it's really the path of winning. And Jesus did win. He must be killed. He takes up a cross, suffering, humiliation, and on the third day is going to be raised to life. It sounds like losing, but we know that it was really winning. And that's the paradox here that Jesus teaches us, that what sounds like losing, denying ourselves, taking on a posture of suffering, humiliation, taking on God's agenda, not ours, sounds like losing, but Jesus says that's really winning. And this is what it means to follow me. It means to take on my posture and take on my priorities, even if that means going through suffering and humiliation, even if that means changing your expectations for the life you've always wanted. It sounds like losing, but it's not. And this is a never-ending journey. This whole idea of taking up your cross. It's a never-ending journey. It begins with choosing Jesus in the first place. It begins with that first time that when we are first confronted with the reality that Jesus is the one God sent. He is both Lord and Christ, and then he died in our place and paid for our sin, and our eternal life depends on whether we turn to him or not. And when we make that change, that's a big change. That is a big shift. And that's the beginning of what it means to deny ourselves and to lose our lives and actually gain in the end. But it doesn't stop there. That's where it first begins, but that's just the beginning of what it means to take up our cross, because it continues to be something that as disciples we have to do on a regular basis. When Luke records this teaching in his gospel, he adds the word daily. You must take up your cross daily and follow me. That's because this is not just a one-time decision when you turn to Jesus. Forgiveness of sins and ask him to become the leader of your life. That's not just a one-time decision. It is a daily decision to follow Jesus as a disciple and take on whatever suffering and humiliation may come your way as you pursue God's purposes for you. And it sounds like losing, but it's not. It sounds like losing, but Jesus goes on to say it's actually how you find true life. That's verse 25. Whoever loses their life, whoever saves their life loses it. Whoever loses their life finds it. It's actually true life. And not only is it true life, as much as it sounds like losing, it's not only true life, it is also what God is going to reward. And we see that in verse 27. For the Son of Man, he's talking about himself, is going to come in his Father's glory with his angels, and then he will reward each person according to what they have done. This is not only how you find true life, this is the life that God rewards. The life that sounds like losing, that takes on this posture and makes God's agenda their priorities. Jesus says he himself is going to come someday. The Son of Man is going to come in his Father's glory. Jesus himself is going to come in glory with angels and reward every person according to what they have done. Now, this is not offering salvation on the basis of good works. I'm going to reward every person according to what they've done. This is offering reward to those disciples who took up their cross, suffering and all, and followed Jesus. Followed his example, followed his way, his teachings wholeheartedly. There is reward in losing your life. It's not losing, it's winning. And then, to close this passage, Jesus says something super cryptic. He says, truly I tell you, some who are standing here will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. What does that mean? What does that mean? And why is it at the end of this teaching? Well, I'll tell you what it means, and then I'll share with you why I think it's at the end of this teaching. What it means is, he's talking about some who are here, talking about the disciples, will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. You can find a lot of different ideas of what that might mean, but I think the explanation that makes the most sense is the explanation that would come if you just kept on reading. Because the very next verse starts a new chapter. It's chapter 17, and it's 6 days later, and Jesus takes Peter, James, and John up on a mountain, and this is the event that's called the Transfiguration. Right? The Transfiguration is where Peter, James, and John get an early glimpse of Jesus in his glory. They got an early glimpse of Jesus glorified. The same Jesus in his Father's glory that he talks about when he comes and rewards. They got a glimpse of Jesus in that glory. They got an early glimpse of what all of us will someday see, Jesus glorified in his full. And I think that's what Jesus is talking about. That is that taste, seeing the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. That's that early glimpse of Jesus in his kingdom. And that's what he's talking about. So I think that's what that verse means, talking about Peter, James, and John seeing the Transfiguration. And I'll tell you why I think it's at the end of this passage. It's at the end of this passage where Jesus says, I'm going to come in my glory and bring reward. I think his point is that that's not as far away as you think it is. The day of my return and my judgment and my reward is not that far away. It's sooner than you think. So, when we're thinking of what all this means for us, we're reminded that when we follow Jesus, we don't get to impose our expectations of what that's going to look like on him. That makes us fans. And we're not called to be fans. We don't get to project expectations of Jesus on him. He gets to clarify expectations for us. When we follow Jesus, we are in a relationship, and he is the Lord. He is the Lord in that relationship, and we are called to be his imitators, to live like him. And when you're imitating a leader who takes up a cross and takes on its posture of suffering and humiliation, and when you follow a leader who takes that posture all the way to death, because that was God's priority for him, then you and I as his followers should not expect any different from us. We can't divorce Jesus' downward call from our downward call, because we are his followers. Now that made Peter panic. Never, Lord, shall this happen to you. It will never happen to you, because if it happens to you, it'll happen to me. But we know that because it happened to Jesus, it brought life to us. And in the same way, if we follow him with this posture and these priorities, that will bring life to us and to others, both now and at Jesus' return. When Jesus returns, we want to be able to say, I followed you. I took up a cross just like you did. That's what he's calling us to do. That's what he's calling us to do. That's challenging stuff, man. Imitating Jesus, living like him, that is challenging stuff. I hope it does for you what it did for the disciples. I think the disciples, they were knocked back on their heels a little bit, and Jesus kind of met them and said, hey, you guys need to think about your expectations here. Let me tell you what it really needs to look like. I think that caught them off guard. In the same way, I think it should knock you and me on our heels a little bit and make us re-examine our expectations, re-examine our posture. Am I willing to take on a posture of suffering and humility? Or do I resist that? And if I resist that, do I understand I am resisting Jesus' posture? It should make us re-examine our priorities. All right? Am I really allowing God to set the agenda for what I should be spending my time on, what I should be spending my money on, what I should be spending my passions on? And it should make us re-examine our expectations of what we hope for in following Jesus. Following Jesus is about adopting his posture, his priorities, because that's where true life is. It's not always popular. It challenges our expectations. It's not always what we hear in the pulpit. All right? It may not be what we heard in Sunday school growing up, but it's true, and it's Jesus' most emphasized statement. This kind of teaching thinned the crowd when Jesus taught it, and it can do the same thing in churches today. You know, hey, if that's what it means to follow Jesus, that's what you're going to teach here about following Jesus. If that's what you're going to teach here, then I'm out of here. All right, I'm going to go somewhere else. It's not what I expected when I signed up. Okay, but Jesus wasn't creating crowds; he was making disciples. The church is not about creating crowds. The church is to be about making disciples. Jesus didn't come to be popular. He came to be followed by disciples who counted the cost and counted him worthy. That's what we want to be at Trinity Bible Church. We want to be disciples who count the cost and count Jesus worthy of that, so that we're willing to take on the posture Jesus took on, suffering, humiliation when it's required, and the priorities that Jesus took on, even if it means exchanging this life for the next, and being willing to follow the Father no matter where it takes us. Being disciples is more important than being a crowd. That's what we want to see God do in us. That's what I want to see God do at Trinity Bible Church. I want to see the Lord make us disciples, not a crowd, but disciples. Wholehearted followers of his Son. So, 3 diagnostic questions for you here at the end. How does Jesus' teaching about taking up your cross, how might you need to change your expectations of what it means to follow Jesus? Think about that for a minute. How might you need to adjust your expectations? To what degree have you been imposing your expectations on Jesus? Second question, how might you need to change your posture to reflect the reality that you are carrying a cross? How might you need to change your relationship with suffering and humility in order to identify and follow Jesus like he modeled? And third, how might you need to change your priorities to make sure that they're about God's purposes for you in the world, not your purposes for yourself? Those questions flow out of this challenging teaching that Jesus gives us. I hope it encourages you, clarifies your expectations, and that in the end you'll count the cost and count Jesus worthy of following. Let's pray. Father, this is big stuff we've talked about. It's very challenging because it impacts our lives in very significant ways. It hits us where we live, just like it hit Peter where he lived. If we hitch our wagon to Jesus, our life might look somewhat like his. And we need to understand that. I pray that through these words that Jesus communicated to us, that you will clarify our expectations, and that we'll adjust our posture, and we'll adjust our priorities accordingly. Show each of us what that means and help us to live it out this week. We ask it through Jesus, in his name, through the Spirit you sent. Amen.
What a great sermon from Pastor Brad. I hadn't really thought about the expectations that we put on those we kind of idolize, and to think that the disciples were starting to do that. And yeah, I always wondered I get it now, but when I was a kid, I would also wonder, why did Jesus want these things kept a secret? And I get it. So I hope that you're thinking about expectations and the expectations you place upon Jesus, your faith, what that looks like. And I just hope that it encourages you to maybe change your posture, your priorities, and your expectations. Thank you, Brad. So, as always, there are 3 ways to give. You can do that online, via text, or through the mail. If you haven't filled out the Connect card, go ahead and do that. And I think that's all I have for you this week. So, without further ado, let me read a quick benediction for you. We are in Philippians chapter 4, verse 6. Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God, and the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and if you're traveling, safe travels, and we will see you next week. Bye.